Dear Mother and Father, I have gone away to walk aboard an alien spaceship, as reoccurring dreams assured a 42-month interstellar voyage to explore the vast universe and then return. I am leaving behind all my possessions to you, as I will no longer require the use of any. Please use the instructions in my will as a guide to help. Love, Granger. These were the final words his family would ever receive from him. Granger Taylor, on a stormy evening in 1980, left his home on Vancouver Island and never returned. His destination, unknown. What really happened to the man who left on a cosmic voyage into the stars and was never seen again? Thank you for joining me, and welcome to the show. Born October 7th of 1948, Granger Ormond Taylor entered this world with high aspirations. Watching him grow from a young age, his parents knew he was destined for a unique life. Many things that would otherwise prove difficult for others to grasp or do seemed to come easily for Granger. Growing up around the small logging and fishing city of Duncan on Vancouver Island, it granted his childhood the gift of being integrated with nature, allowing him to have a deep appreciation for life and the world around him. He would learn at a very young age, though, life is never fair. On a vacation with his parents and siblings to the family cabin out at Horn Lake, his father tragically drowned, leaving the family to go through life without him. A few years after that, Granger's mother, Grace, would eventually then meet his stepfather, Jim Taylor, who would bring in 3 step-siblings for Granger and then eventually a half-brother. Jim would quickly become a positive figure in his life, a man who loved him right from the beginning as if he was his own. He was always there to support Granger, whether it be with offering up an ear to listen to his problems or provide interest in his many hobbies. Jim filled that fatherly role perfectly. As the years continued to pass by, it became evident to Grace and Jim that Granger stood out among their other children. While the others were like typical kids, loud, active, and sociable, they had found Granger to be rather the opposite. He was a shy boy, usually keeping to himself and only allowing select people into his life. The social skills he lacked were replaced with curiosity and an appetite for tinkering with things. Early in his life, one could find him alone in his room, constantly taking apart small toys or his bedside clock, if only in an attempt to understand their inner workings. He proved time and time again that his intelligence was beyond normal of that of a small child, but despite that, he showed very little interest in his actual studies. He found learning by means of books and papers to be rather dull and not at all stimulating his mind, but rather thrived by being a hands-on learner, quickly picking up on skills and talents that would have taken years for anyone else to learn, including adults. Eventually, he came to realize he had no interest in his schoolwork and opted to drop out of the education system after completing the 8th grade at only 13 years old. And being as gifted as he was for mechanical work, he instantly gained the attention and employment of his neighbor, who hired the boy as an apprentice for his auto shop. It's here Granger absorbed and gained the knowledge he would go on to practice for the rest of his life. Even though the work came naturally for him, he tirelessly pushed himself to learn more. After only a year of working on vehicles, his fascination for mechanical work grew into not only a means for an income, but also as the hobby that would define who he would be known as. The year he spent working on cars led him to fully delve into the practice of fixing things, a talent that quickly surpassed that of even his boss. Granger's first major accomplishment came when he managed to fully resurrect and restore a 1-cylinder car to full working order at just 14 years of age. His uncanny ability to fix virtually anything he could get his hands on only grew after the successful restoration of the car. He knew anyone with enough time and practice could eventually restore a vehicle, so he wanted to pursue something bigger. For several years, he wouldn't discover what that bigger project would turn out to be. So in the meantime, to keep himself busy, he took it upon himself to set up his own mechanic shop in his parents' backyard, where he would spend most of his days tinkering with old broken down machines and helping those who would come to him with theirs. Oftentimes, Granger would find himself in the company of the neighborhood kids and a few of the adults who were fascinated with the work he would conduct. There didn't seem to be a problem he couldn't fix, and he quickly gained the reputation around town for being a genius when it came to fixing things. It wouldn't be until around 3 years later would we find Granger still waiting for that next project that would actually challenge him. Now in his late teens, he was wandering around on the outskirts of town, pondering to himself what could possibly be his next test. It was in that moment would he come across an old, rusted-up bulldozer previously used and owned by the local logging company in the area. After their veteran heavy-duty mechanics deemed it unfixable and left it abandoned a few years prior, it was when Granger's eyes fell upon this hulking metal mass did he instantly know his talents would finally be put to the test once more, and hopefully would be able to save the large machine from its fate. It wasn't in terrible physical condition, mainly just rust forming on its frame and paint peeling off the sides. It didn't run, but that's what Granger was hoping for anyways. It wouldn't be much of a challenge if the bulldozer was in working order. After freeing the tracks from their seized positions and tediously pulling the machine all the way back to his parents' farm, he instantly plunged himself into his work, rarely ever seen to be doing anything else other than working on his new toy. Amazingly, Granger had no issues in restoring the rusted bulldozer to its former glory, astounding everyone around him, especially those who had previously thought it a hopeless endeavor. While it did take him some more time compared to the car, in just roughly around a year, Granger had a practically brand new, fully functional bulldozer he would go on to use quite often. With his many achievements at such a young age, opening his own shop, rebuilding both a functioning car in his mid-teens and an entire decommissioned bulldozer, his greatest accomplishments were still yet to come. In his early 20s, while again out for another walk, his head likely full of new ideas and concepts, he managed to stumble upon a long-forgotten steam locomotive in the woods, likely left behind when it no longer ran. The condition on which he found it would have caused anyone else to dismiss it as a lost cause. The entire thing was rusted over and trees were literally sprouting right through the chassis. Not to mention that it was surrounded by the forest and would take a considerable amount of time to even extract it from its resting place. But Granger was special. He always saw the best in things, the potential. He was not about to let this project pass him by, so he got to work. Thanks to the help of his new bulldozer, removing some of the debris and foliage out of the way proved to be an easy task. By the use of dynamite, which was commonly used at the time, he was able to blast trees and fallen logs into nothing but splinters to allow him enough room to build train tracks on the forest floor, then pull the train onto them and bring it back to his shop. The whole process to even get it out of the woods occupied his time for months on end, and the amount of work he would have to do to restore it would take years. But Granger did it. Not only was he able to restore it to appear the way it did when the locomotive was originally created, but he also restored it to complete working order. And surprisingly, his most impressive crowning achievement wasn't even that. It was when he came to obtain an old World War II fighter plane, a P-40 Kitty Hawk, and completely managed to restore it. It's one thing to restore something that drives on the ground with no specialized training, but to completely restore, by this point, a several decades old airplane and then to sell it to a collector for tens of thousands of dollars, the sheer determination and passion Granger possessed was unlike any other person on the island at the time. Granger Taylor quickly became a local treasure. A large, stocky man who was otherwise quite shy and quiet, but was a genuinely kind and helpful person who didn't hesitate to help out those who came to him or spoke with him regarding his interests. His work often occupied his time, so he didn't really go out much, but whenever someone would come to him, he would happily show them what he was working on. Whenever someone approached him for help, he was always happy to do so. With the use of his new bulldozer, Granger was always helping his neighbors clear debris from an area or help dig and pull out tree stumps from yards. When the neighborhood kids would swarm the farm, asking a barrage of questions about what he was working on and how to do certain things, he was always more than happy to teach those around him. Oftentimes, one could find the man giving the local kids rides in the small car he had restored, or by use of the tracks he had built to bring his train to his shop, he would drive it back and forth on the small stretch of land on his parents' property, blowing the horn and giving rides to children and their parents who came to see another one of his amazing builds. But like all people, Granger had his struggles. Even though he had accomplished so many impressive feats, he still felt lost. He was bored. Every project he would take on thinking it would challenge him only turned out to be a way to occupy his time. He desperately searched for that project that would finally put his skills to the test, but it never showed itself. Granger Taylor was trapped, stuck in an era that limited his potential. It wasn't long before he realized this fact and began the search for that final fulfillment. On a clear summer night in the 70s, while staring up at the glittering night sky, he found his answer and realized where his destiny truly lied. Following the end of World War II, hundreds of reports of flying saucers, or Foo Fighters as they were called back then, being spotted by pilots and civilians all across the globe, rose to prominence as news networks picked up their stories, and then the eventual rise of extraterrestrials in entertainment. With cases like the Roswell incident in '47 or the abductions of Betty and Barney Hill in '61, UFOs and little green men quickly became a cultural phenomenon and were widely regarded as one of life's most intriguing mysteries. With the emergence of pop culture like Star Wars or Star Trek, glorifying space travel and interacting with these beings from the stars, it provided a sense of wonderment and fascination for people like Granger, who completely immersed themselves in the thought of being like the heroes they'd seen on the big screen. But Granger, he took it a step further. Unlike many who had seen the movies or heard tales of real-life encounters, Granger realized this was the next step for him. The fact that nobody understood the workings of alien spaceships, what their full purpose was, or how they operated, offered up Granger a goal. He wanted to be one of the first humans to actually understand them. A few years prior, back in 1969, while he had been immersed in his work on the train and not yet showed interest in UFOs, an incident at Cowichan District Hospital, not far from where Granger's home was, came flooding back to his memory. At around 5 in the morning, while tending to patients in the geriatric wing, several hospital staff working the night shift, along with their patients, had allegedly seen a glowing flying saucer hovering silently outside the window about 3 stories off the ground. Doreen Kendall, the first nurse to observe the object, claimed she had witnessed 2 humanoid pilots standing in the cockpit, staring out its window looking back at her. As the strange aircraft began floating away and out of sight, the other nurses who were responding to Kendall's screams came rushing to her side to witness the craft speeding off into the night sky, its lights disappearing among the twinkling glow of the stars. As it turned out, the nurses at the hospital weren't the only ones to have seen the strange craft that morning either. Citizens from across Duncan and beyond all reported they too had seen the mysterious lights of the craft hovering around their town. For months, the incident became a popular talking point among the residents of Duncan, as well as most of Vancouver Island. And it was this incident that may have very well sparked Granger's initial interest in the topic, long before even he realized it. The thought of the UFO sighting and the impossible feat of understanding them fully consumed his mind. For starters, Granger spent the better part of a year building a life-size replica of his interpretation of what a UFO was supposed to be like on his parents' property. Using 2 satellite dishes he had salvaged, he constructed his own UFO, outfitted with a television, couch, and wood-burning stove to keep the interior of it nice and warm. And it's here Granger would then spend most of his time, inside that small metal room, thinking up creative ways on how to approach the task of studying the operation of similar aircraft. The months of pondering and pouring his life into the study of these machines seemed to have eventually paid off for him, as one night he was allegedly able to establish what he called mental communications with extraterrestrials from another galaxy. By this time, Granger was in his early 30s and had become a well-known member of the community thanks to his talent and generosity in helping or teaching those who came to him. Most just believed his obsession was just another one of his many quirks. The man was a little strange, so nobody took his claims of contacting aliens seriously. They thought it was just Granger daydreaming. One of his good friends, a neighborhood teen named Robert Keller, who oftentimes as a child would come to the Taylor farm to watch Granger work and ask him questions, eventually grew close to Granger and despite their age difference, became one of his closest friends. Years later, Robert was quoted saying, "Granger and I were inseparable for years. Everywhere he went, I was on his heels. Granger and I were like best friends." The two, along with a few others at times, would often spend their evenings relaxing in Granger's makeshift UFO behind his parents' house, smoking and sharing joints and discussing the nature of existence and the world around them. During this time, there was still very little by means of entertainment, so this was a way they would pass the time, and the topic of UFOs and space was never far from their conversations. Time and time again, Granger would bring up the idea of intergalactic space travel and what it would take to create a vehicle capable of doing so. His friends, of course, humored him, participating in the discussion, but unlike Granger, they believed the whole idea to be nothing more than just wishful thinking. They would soon learn, though, that Granger's obsession with the topic would end up with him going to extreme measures to see it become reality. One day while visiting, Robert had found Granger constructing a large radio antenna onto the roof of his UFO, to which he claimed would help him easier receive the signals from those attempting to contact him. Now, Robert thought this was a little strange, but Granger was anything but a normal kind of guy, so he passed this off as just another one of his harmless extensions onto one of his passion projects. After weeks of talking with the supposed aliens from a distant world, Granger confided in Robert about what they had been discussing. He wanted to know how they flew their saucers, so on multiple occasions he would ask them, but they would only share a little bit at a time. Eventually, Granger said he learned the propulsion system they used had something to do with magnetism, but wasn't filled in on the specifics. This was all interesting to Robert, but the real bombshell Granger would drop on him and their other friend Bob Nielsen was in October of 1980 when he spoke to them about his future plans. He was convinced the aliens were coming for him, that they offered him a trip of a lifetime, traveling through the deepest regions of the Milky Way. His friends were confused at first, originally passing off what he was saying as just the ramblings of a weird dream or an invasive thought while under the influence of drugs, but they knew Granger about as well as anyone could. His demeanor and his cadence suggested to them he was completely of sound mind and was absolutely serious in his words. They also figured if extraterrestrial life were to come to Earth and get into contact with someone here, Granger would undoubtedly be the first one they would want to talk to. So they did what any good friends would do. They offered to go along on the trip as well, standing by his side. Granger wouldn't hear of it though. Unlike him, he pointed out to his younger friends they had far too much to leave behind here on Earth. He didn't really get into specifics, but he told them they were going to meet him somewhere unknown, and they planned on coming on a rainy day so as to hide their aircraft from onlookers or anyone else who might try to interfere. Robert and Bob honestly did not know what to think about Granger's proclamation. They were his friends after all, and they did support him in all of his endeavors, but this was a little over the top. He had always been a little eccentric, but this was something else. Still though, they knew it was best not to argue with the man when it came to something he was obviously passionate about, so they just dropped it and let Granger prepare. The storm of the century, they would call it. Just a month later, on the 29th of November, Vancouver Island was rocked by gale-force winds and torrential rain. Cities and towns were cut off from one another, the lightning effectively snuffing out any kind of power that would allow for easy communication or basic amenities. Come morning, those who attempted to wait out the storm and sleep through it awoke to complete chaos. For his stepfather, Jim Taylor, his morning was far more destructive. Jim was the one to find the note, tacked onto his wooden bedroom door. A note describing his worst nightmare. It was carefully written on a single piece of paper, with a map on the backside detailing very little in terms on where he may have gone. Outside, the spot where his bright pink Datsun pickup truck usually sat parked was empty. It, along with Granger, had simply vanished. Immediately, the Taylor family began their search. They got into contact with the local police, who were already busy with the aftermath of the storm, but they were able to find out the last place Granger had been seen at. At around 6:30 in the evening the following night, just before the storm hit, patrons at the local diner, Bob's Grill, claimed Granger had walked in and had a meal there. He sat alone and didn't say much, simply ordered his meal, ate, and then left. Hardly a change from Granger's typical behavior, so nobody thought anything of it. But after he departed the small diner, that was the last time anyone would ever see the man again. Granger Taylor seemed to have completely vanished off the face of the earth that night, never to be seen again. The mystery behind the disappearance of Granger Taylor weighed heavy on those he left behind. They never truly knew what happened to him. The note he had left behind presented itself as a final goodbye, almost like a suicide note. But those who knew him personally refused to believe he was suicidal. The family checked hospitals all across the island, deep into the woods of old forgotten logging roads, and followed the path detailed on the crudely drawn map found on the backside of the note. Still, nothing came from any of the searches. Despite the family driving all across the island searching for him and hundreds of police doing the same, they were never able to find him or his pink truck. And this is what puzzled people the most. For something so noticeable and large to have also vanished into thin air with him, it stuck out to those investigating. It wasn't long before people began asking themselves if Granger wasn't delusional about the aliens after all. Maybe they really had come and taken him, along with his truck, away on an intergalactic voyage like he claimed they would. As the months slowly passed by with no new developments in the investigation, the family realized in Granger's will he had crossed out the words deceased and replaced them with the words departed, eerily hinting to the fact that he never intended to die, but to simply leave, then return at some point like the note had stated. His friends and family were split. Some wanted to believe in Granger so much they stood by his claims and believed he really had gone up into the stars on an alien spaceship, while others came to the conclusion he had likely died at some point, whether by accident or on purpose. The months eventually would turn into years, with still no sign or word on their favorite genius. As the 42-month deadline grew closer, those who still held out hope grew anxious to see if he would keep his word and finally return like he said he would on his note. His stepbrother Douglas stayed out all night, the same night that Granger was supposed to return on. But as the hours passed by gazing into the inky blackness of space, attempting to spot the spaceship carrying his brother among the millions of flashing stars, he slowly realized it was never coming, and his brother truly was gone for good. Not long after the 42-month deadline came and went, about 6 years after Granger's initial disappearance, forestry workers working on Mount Prevost, a small mountain not far from the Taylor property, discovered a small impact crater just off the logging road that hinted an explosion had taken place there at some point. Now, they weren't exactly sure what could have possibly have made this type of damage, but thought it was strange enough to take a closer look. While digging through the loose dirt and fallen leaves, the workers discovered something strange buried in the crater. What seemed like rusted metal fragments of something large dotted the inside and surrounding area of the pit. Now, they didn't exactly know what they had stumbled upon, so they got into contact with the police to come and assess what they had discovered. They thoroughly searched the entire area, but came up with very little in terms of definite answers. They found more pieces of metal scattered nearby in the forest, but what they found incredibly damning was multiple bone fragments being present. With the thought not far from their minds and determining the metal pieces were from a Datsun pickup truck, they concluded the bones found on the scene belonged to none other than Granger Taylor, the man who was supposed to have gone into space, but never made it off the mountain. This revelation sent ripples into the community of Duncan. The closure the entire family needed was finally there. They just needed to accept it. The problem was, both friends and family found the discovery a little suspicious. At the time, DNA profiling was extremely new. The only places who used it were larger cities like London or New York. The police in the small city of Duncan certainly had no way in determining if the bones found on the scene were truly Granger's or not. Second, the police who determined what the metal pieces belonged to, the Datsun pickup truck, neglected the fact that Granger's truck was painted bright pink, but the remains found they said were colored baby blue. So they couldn't say for certainty what they had found up on that mountain. If the remains did belong to Granger, what could have happened to him up there on that stormy night back in 1980? The coroner's office who helped with the investigation concluded that Granger had been traveling up the mountain, likely carrying some of the dynamite he often used for blasting out tree stumps and to clear away debris for his projects. At some point during his trip up the mountain, the dynamite he had been transporting ignited, effectively blowing up the truck along with Granger inside. Those who knew him knew Granger had a complete understanding in how to handle and use dynamite, and likely it wasn't an accident, unless of course the unlikely event that lightning had managed to strike the bundle and set it off. Regardless on how the dynamite might have ended up exploding, the idea sent shivers down the spines of those who knew Granger. They were now stuck with wondering what his motivation was in traveling up the mountain with a truck full of explosives. The horrifying thought that he purposely brought the dynamite up there with the intention of killing himself was the first thought that came to mind for his friends and family. But still, there were those who were closest to him who disagreed with that idea, that Granger was in any way suicidal. They desperately thought up of any possible explanation. Perhaps he had taken the dynamite as a way to signal the spacecraft of his location, using his truck and the gasoline inside as a form of kindling for the explosion. Then, perhaps after seeing the fireball launch into the sky, the aliens were then able to come and retrieve him. It's a stretch, but for those hoping their Granger was still alive somewhere, any explanation was worth consideration. Losing a family member and a friend can be hard. Sometimes you don't want to admit that they're gone, that something else could have happened to them. But the case surrounding Granger only really has two options. He either died on that mountain or he was taken away. As far as anyone knows, he hasn't returned. Multiple theories have popped up since his disappearance, but none can fully explain everything. There are those who believe he did indeed die on that mountain during that storm, either on purpose or by accident. His mother Grace and friend Robert believed he was taken away on a journey through the stars. But there have been others who have offered up alternatives, ideas bouncing around online internet forums, saying perhaps Granger had simply wanted to start a new life somewhere new, effectively faking his own death and leaving the island forever. If this were true, perhaps it makes sense why he told his mother and father on the note that everything he owned now belongs to them. But that could also be said if he was in fact leaving to commit suicide. Others have pointed out his social situation. While Granger had his fair share of issues fitting in with those around him, oftentimes struggling to connect with people, including his own family, he still had those around him who loved him, and he knew that. He loved them too. For him to all of a sudden abandon his family and friends with nothing more than a single note as a goodbye, to go start a new life somewhere else, never to return or contact them again, it just doesn't fit his character. Others have brought up space travel itself, claiming that time could possibly be different for Granger compared to us. What would only seem like a single year to him could be much longer for us. Perhaps then it's only a matter of time before he eventually returns home and to a far different world than the one he left behind. For those more desperate answer seekers, some suggested that maybe aliens had exploded Datson's truck to pieces to leave the impression that he was indeed dead, but really was alive and well. Or because of his brilliance and knack for mechanical work, he was possibly picked up by a secret government agency. But these are likely not the case. When it comes down to it, we really just do not know what actually happened to him. Evidence points to the idea that he had been killed by the explosion of the dynamite, but there's insufficient evidence to say that with 100% certainty. especially since the bone fragments, believed to be his, have since gone missing. Later on, it would come out, along with the marijuana he would occasionally smoke with his friends, he had also been dabbling with a little bit of acid. Never a lot, so his family claimed, but enough to make them wonder after the fact on if he had been silently struggling with some kind of depression, and perhaps imagined the alien voices in his head and fully believed them to be real. Whatever is the case, the fact remains we still have no definite answer on what really happened to Granger Taylor. He has yet to return, and we have yet to find any sufficient evidence to say what really happened one way or another. Since his disappearance, the one-cylinder car and steam locomotive he had restored had become featured at the BC Forest Discovery Center in Duncan. Exhibits thoroughly enjoyed and fascinated hundreds of visitors for years. His parents, Grace and Jim Taylor, have since passed away, never learning the true fate of their lost boy. Over the years, Jim fondly thought back to the night before the storm, the last time he had ever seen his son. Granger had entered his parents' bedroom and had a long, heartfelt conversation with him. He wanted to thank Jim for always being there for him, and tell him how much gratitude and love he had for the man who filled that fatherly role in his life. For Grace, it was much harder to remember the last conversation she had with Granger. The night of his disappearance, she was away on her first vacation in years in Hawaii. She never got a chance to say goodbye, or look into the eyes of her son one last time. She always regretted leaving him, and his best friend Robert Keller still waits up at night, watching the sky for any sign of the man he once called a brother, wondering to himself where he could have gone, and if he would ever see him again. If Granger really did die up on that mountain in 1980, hopefully he found the peace he was desperately searching for. If he did somehow find his way onto an alien spaceship, currently flying through clouds of pink and purple dust, and visiting distant incredible worlds, hopefully he's having the time of his life, learning all the wonders of the universe. He was a man of incredible, unique genius, who surpassed his talents here on Earth and hopefully found the answers he was seeking somewhere else. Wherever he might be, Granger will always remain with us, as a fond memory of an eccentric, kind, and intelligent person who not only inspired those around him, but also bettered their lives by being a part of them. Granger Taylor, if this message reaches you, wherever you are, please come home soon. Your family and friends are still waiting for you. The mystery of Canada's spaceman, Granger Taylor, is a story that has been cemented in the books of ufology ever since the word has gotten out. The strange part is, despite multiple theories floating around, we have no definite evidence to say what truly happened to the man. I personally hope he was right, and aliens did end up coming for him to show him around the galaxy, but that might be just wishful thinking. What do you think, though? Do you believe Granger had died on the mountain? Or he's floating around in space somewhere, or do you believe another theory? Be sure to reach out to me and let me know. You can contact me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast. Even if you just wanted to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. For those of you looking to support the show, becoming a patron supporter is the best way to go about it. You can find the Patreon by going to moonlightlore.com and following the links there, or by following the link in the description of this episode. For only $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive bonus content I throw up on there. It does go a long way in helping with the cost of creating the show, so please consider doing so. I know not everyone can donate at this time, so if you're still wanting to support the show, sharing it with your friends and family is the next best way to go about doing that. Giving the show a 5-star rating on Spotify or iTunes or whatever app you might be listening on helps tremendously too. Both ways help spread the show to new listeners and grows it. I hope you enjoyed hearing the life and mysterious end of Granger Taylor, and I hope you'll join me next time for a new mystery or story. As always, following the show definitely will keep you updated on new episodes that come out, so be sure to hit the subscribe or follow button. But until then, everyone take care, and I'll see you next time.